In October 1935, the most advanced bomber America had ever built lifted off from a runway in Ohio. 5 minutes later, it crashed. The left wing dropped. The aircraft rolled over. It slammed into the ground in a ball of fire. 2 of the 5 men on board were killed. The newspapers called it proof that the airplane was too complicated to fly. The United States Army cancelled Boeing's contract. The company lost the competition. By every reasonable measure, the aircraft should have disappeared into history. Instead, it became the bomber that dropped more bombs than any other aircraft of the Second World War. It flew nearly 2 million combat sorties. It carried over 640,000 tons of bombs across occupied Europe. It became the symbol of American air power and one of the most recognizable airplanes ever built. This is the story of how a disastrous crash nearly destroyed Boeing before creating the B-17 Flying Fortress. The story begins several years before the airplane itself existed. In the early 1930s, the United States Army Air Corps faced an uncomfortable reality. Its bomber force was obsolete. Most American bombers were slow, short-ranged biplanes designed during the final years of the First World War. Aviation technology was advancing at extraordinary speed. Civilian airliners were becoming larger, faster, and capable of flying farther than many military aircraft. If another global war erupted, America's bomber fleet would already be outdated. The Air Corps wanted something entirely different, not another incremental improvement, a revolution. In 1934, it issued a requirement unlike anything that had come before. The new aircraft had to fly at least 200 miles per hour. It had to reach an altitude of 10,000 feet in under 10 minutes. Most importantly, it needed a range exceeding 2,000 miles. No existing American bomber could accomplish all three. The requirement effectively demanded an entirely new class of aircraft. Most manufacturers considered the specifications unrealistic. Boeing did not. The company desperately needed a victory. Founded in 1916 by William Boeing, the manufacturer had built successful mail planes and civilian transports, but military contracts remained fiercely competitive. The Great Depression had devastated the aviation industry. Orders disappeared. Factories slowed. Thousands of skilled workers lost their jobs. Survival depended on winning government contracts. Failure could threaten the company's future. Leading Boeing's engineering team was a quiet, methodical designer named Edward Curtis Wells. Unlike many aviation pioneers of the era, Wells believed performance came not from individual breakthroughs, but from combining dozens of small engineering improvements into a single aircraft. Every pound mattered. Every rivet mattered. Every aerodynamic surface mattered. His team ignored conventional wisdom. Instead of building another twin-engine bomber like most competitors, Boeing proposed something radically different. 4 engines. No American bomber in Army service had ever been designed around 4 engines. The additional power dramatically increased payload, range, and reliability. If one engine failed, the aircraft could continue flying. If 2 failed, it still had a chance. For long flights over oceans or hostile territory, redundancy meant survival. The bomber also featured an all-metal stressed skin structure. Instead of relying on external bracing wires common on earlier aircraft, the aluminum skin itself carried much of the structural load. The result was lighter, stronger, and significantly more aerodynamic. Retractable landing gear, reduced drag, variable pitch propellers improved efficiency during every phase of flight. The cockpit sat high above a sleek, streamlined nose that looked decades ahead of its time. Everything about the airplane suggested speed. The prototype received the internal designation Model 299. Construction moved at remarkable speed. Engineers worked around the clock. Every completed component represented a gamble. Nothing this ambitious had ever been attempted by Boeing's military division. On July 28, 1935, The finished prototype rolled out of Boeing's plant in Seattle. It dwarfed every bomber beside it. Its wings stretched more than 103 feet. Its 4 Pratt & Whitney engines produced nearly 3,000 horsepower combined. Its maximum bomb load exceeded anything the Army currently operated. Reporters gathered around the aircraft in disbelief. One journalist looked at the growing collection of defensive machine guns mounted around the airframe. There were guns in the nose, guns above the fuselage, guns below, guns covering the sides. Wherever enemy fighters approached, someone could fire back. The reporter searched for the right description. Finally, he wrote 2 words that would become aviation history. Flying Fortress. The nickname appeared in newspapers before Boeing had even chosen one. The company immediately trademarked it. From that moment forward, the Model 299 became the Flying Fortress. In August 1935, Boeing flew the prototype across the United States to Wright Field in Ohio for the Army's bomber competition. Waiting there were 2 rivals, the twin-engine Douglas DB-1 and the Martin Model 146. Both were capable aircraft. Both were cheaper. Neither looked remotely as ambitious as Boeing's creation. Army officers watched as the Flying Fortress took to the sky. The difference was obvious almost immediately. It climbed faster. It flew higher. It carried more. It flew farther. It reached nearly 252 miles per hour, around 50 miles per hour faster than the Army's minimum requirement. Test pilots praised its handling despite its enormous size. Observers began assuming the competition was already over. One Army officer reportedly described the outcome as a foregone conclusion. Boeing was preparing to win one of the largest military aviation contracts in American history. Then came October 30th, 1935. The final demonstration flight. Experienced Army test pilot Major Ployer Peter Hill occupied the left seat. Boeing's chief test pilot, Les Tower, sat beside him. Neither man realized one small device still locked the airplane's controls. It was called a gust lock. When parked on the ground, strong winds could slam an aircraft's control surfaces back and forth, damaging hinges and cables. The gust lock prevented that movement. Before takeoff, pilots were supposed to remove it. The pre-flight checklist had not been completed. As the Flying Fortress accelerated down the runway, the elevators could barely move. The bomber lifted into the air. Immediately, it began climbing far too steeply. Hill fought desperately to push the nose down. Nothing happened. The controls remained locked. The aircraft stalled less than 300 feet above the ground. Seconds later, America's most advanced bomber crashed in flames before hundreds of stunned witnesses. Major Hill died from his injuries. Les Tower died shortly afterward. The Army immediately halted the competition. Investigators concluded that the aircraft itself had not failed. The engines worked. The structure remained sound. The crash was caused by pilot error. It didn't matter. Army regulations prohibited awarding the production contract to an aircraft that had crashed during evaluation. The victory instantly belonged to Douglas. Boeing lost an order worth more than $65 million in today's money. For a company already struggling through the Depression, it was catastrophic. Most stories would end here. A failed competition, a cancelled contract, a promising airplane remembered only as an expensive mistake. But something about the Flying Fortress refused to be forgotten, because despite the crash, everyone who had watched it fly knew they had just seen the future. The crash should have ended the Flying Fortress forever. Instead, it created one of the greatest military aircraft programs in history. The Army never forgot what it had seen during the competition. The prototype had crashed because of a simple human mistake, not because the airplane was flawed. The aircraft had simply become too advanced for the procedures pilots had used for decades. The solution was almost embarrassingly simple. Pilots created a written checklist. Every critical control was verified before takeoff. control locks removed, fuel selectors checked, trim set, mixtures adjusted, engines verified. One page of paper transformed the way pilots interacted with increasingly complex machines. The modern aviation checklist, now used by every commercial airline on Earth, owes much of its existence to the lessons learned from the B-17 crash. Meanwhile, Europe was moving toward catastrophe. Germany reoccupied the Rhineland. Austria disappeared into the Third Reich. Czechoslovakia was dismantled. The Spanish Civil War gave the Luftwaffe a testing ground for modern air combat. Across Europe, military planners reached the same conclusion. The next war would be decided not just by armies on the ground, but by industry. Whoever could destroy the enemy's factories, railroads, oil refineries, and power plants first would possess an overwhelming advantage. The United States Army Air Corps had spent years developing a revolutionary theory: strategic bombing. Instead of grinding through trench warfare or massive infantry assaults, carefully planned formations of heavy bombers would strike the industrial heart of an enemy nation. Destroy the factories and the tanks could never be built. Destroy the refineries and the aircraft would never leave the ground. Destroy transportation networks and entire armies would slowly starve. The theory demanded an aircraft unlike anything that existed. It needed to fly farther than fighters, carry several tons of bombs, operate at altitudes where anti-aircraft guns became less effective, and survive enemy interception long enough to reach its target. The B-17 appeared to be that aircraft. When war erupted in Europe in September 1939, the United States officially remained neutral, but production accelerated immediately. Boeing's Seattle factory expanded. New assembly plants opened. Thousands of engineers, machinists, riveters, electricians, and mechanics joined the workforce. Yet Boeing still faced a problem that threatened the entire program. The Air Corps wanted bombers by the thousands. Boeing simply could not build them fast enough. The answer was unprecedented. Rather than keeping production to itself, Boeing shared its designs with competitors. Douglas Aircraft, Lockheed's Vega division. Companies that normally fought for government contracts suddenly became manufacturing partners. 3 rival manufacturers would build the same airplane. No American aircraft had ever been produced this way before. The factories became enormous machines themselves. Raw aluminum entered one end. Finished bombers rolled out the other. Thousands of individual parts arrived from suppliers across the country. Engines from one state, instruments from another, tires, radios, machine guns, hydraulic systems, propellers, ammunition feeds, oxygen bottles, electrical wiring. Each component had to fit perfectly, regardless of which factory had built the aircraft. The tolerances were astonishing. A wing produced hundreds of miles away had to bolt directly onto a fuselage built somewhere else without modification. Mass production was becoming an engineering weapon. By 1941, the B-17E entered service with dramatic improvements. The vulnerable shark fin tail was replaced by a much larger vertical stabilizer. A powered tail turret finally protected the bomber's weakest angle. Additional gun positions strengthened the aircraft's defences. Crew protection improved. Armour plating increased. Fuel systems became more reliable. The Flying Fortress was beginning to resemble the aircraft that history would remember. Then, on December 7, 1941, everything changed. Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Within hours, the United States entered the Second World War. Every debate about bomber procurement ended instantly. America would now fight a global war across 2 oceans. Factories that had seemed enormous suddenly looked too small. Aircraft production exploded. Civilian automobile factories converted into bomber plants. Entire communities grew around assembly lines operating 24 hours a day. Workers who had never touched an airplane before learned to build one. Women entered industrial jobs by the hundreds of thousands. Farm boys became riveters. Teachers became inspectors. Mechanics became aircraft assemblers. America was transforming itself into what President Franklin Roosevelt would call the arsenal of democracy. The B-17 sat at the centre of that transformation. Yet building the airplane was only half the challenge. The other half was finding young men willing to fly it. A B-17 crew consisted of 10: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners. Each required months of specialised training. Each depended completely on the others. Inside the aircraft there was almost no room to move. The fuselage narrowed into cramped tunnels. The waist gunners stood opposite one another with only thin aluminum separating them from the freezing air outside. The nose compartment offered spectacular visibility and almost no protection from incoming fire. At altitude, temperatures regularly fell below -40 degrees. Frost formed on the inside of the aircraft. Machine guns could freeze. Hydraulic systems stiffened. Crew members wore electrically heated flight suits because exposed skin could freeze to bare metal within seconds. Oxygen became life itself. Above 25,000 feet, a disconnected oxygen hose meant unconsciousness in minutes. Every man constantly checked not only his own equipment, but the equipment of everyone around him. The bomber demanded teamwork, unlike almost any other military machine. One engine could fail, sometimes 2. The aircraft could often continue flying, but if the crew stopped functioning as a single unit, the mission usually ended in disaster. By the summer of 1942, the first B-17 groups began arriving in Britain. Their mission sounded straightforward: fly across occupied Europe, bomb German industry, return home. Reality proved far more brutal. The Americans believed the flying fortress could defend itself. German fighter pilots intended to prove otherwise. The true test of Boeing's bomber was finally about to begin. Not in a wind tunnel, not during army trials, but over the skies of occupied Europe, where every engineering decision would be judged by whether 10 young men returned home or disappeared forever into the clouds. The first combat mission shattered nearly every assumption the Americans had made. The Air Corps believed tightly packed formations of flying fortresses could defend themselves with overlapping fields of machine gun fire. German commanders believed concentrated fighter attacks would tear those formations apart before they ever reached their targets. Both theories would be tested at 25,000 feet. On August 17, 1942, 18 B-17 bombers of the 97th Bomb Group crossed the English Channel and bombed the railway yards at Rouen, France. The mission was small. The target was close. Most importantly, the bombers returned. For the American public, it was proof that daylight precision bombing could work. For the crews, it was only the beginning. As the raids pushed deeper into occupied Europe, German resistance intensified. The Luftwaffe adapted quickly. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s attacked in coordinated waves, diving through bomber formations at closing speeds of over 600 miles per hour. The Flying Fortress fought back with up to 13 50 caliber machine guns, but every attack became a brutal exchange of seconds. A single cannon shell could destroy an engine, another could kill the pilot, another could ignite fuel. The formations tightened. Bombers flew so close together that each aircraft protected the next with overlapping gunfire. Leave the formation and your chances of survival collapsed. The Germans called isolated bombers easy prey. The Americans called them stragglers. By 1943, England had become a floating city of flying fortresses. Hundreds of bombers filled its airfields. Before dawn, engines thundered to life one after another. Crews ate heavy breakfasts because they might not eat again. Curtains hid the maps until the final briefing. Only then did officers pull back the cloth and stretch a string across Europe toward the day's target. The farther the string reached into Germany, the quieter the room became. Then came August 17, 1943, Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Two massive formations, two critical industrial targets. One disastrous day. Weather separated the bomber streams, allowing the Luftwaffe to attack each force individually. Without long-range escort fighters, hundreds of German aircraft descended on the flying fortresses. The sky became a running battle. Bombers exploded in mid-air. Damaged aircraft drifted behind the formation before fighters finished them off. Still, the crews pressed forward. They dropped their bombs. They turned for home. 60 B-17s never made it back. More than 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. 2 months later came Black Thursday, October 14, 1943. The 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt. This time, 291 flying fortresses crossed into Germany with almost no fighter protection. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Nearly every available German fighter unit attacked. Head-on assaults, rocket attacks, cannons firing at point-blank range. The battle stretched across hundreds of miles of sky. When the survivors finally landed back in England, 60 bombers had been destroyed. Another 17 were too badly damaged to fly again. Entire crews vanished. Barracks emptied. Replacement airmen arrived to sleep in beds occupied only days earlier by men who would never return. Officially, a crew had to complete 25 missions before going home. Unofficially, many believed they would never reach 10. Yet every morning, the engines started again. Back in America, Boeing answered the losses the only way it could. It built more flying fortresses. Assembly lines accelerated. Douglas and Lockheed joined production. Factories worked around the clock. Eventually, more than 12,700 B-17s would be built. America could replace airplanes. It could not replace experienced crews. By the end of 1943, the entire strategy of daylight bombing stood on the edge of collapse. The Flying Fortress had proven it could reach Germany. It had proven it could destroy factories. But it had also proven one terrifying reality. No bomber, no matter how heavily armed, could survive alone. If nothing changed, the bomber offensive would bleed itself to death long before Germany did. The solution was already taking shape thousands of miles away. It wasn't another bomber. It was a fighter that could finally fly all the way to Berlin. By the spring of 1945, the outcome of the air war was no longer in doubt. The Luftwaffe had been shattered. German oil production had collapsed. Rail networks lay in ruins. Factories that once supplied Hitler's armies operated only intermittently, starved of electricity, fuel, and raw materials. The strategic bombing campaign had not won the war by itself, but it had crippled Germany's ability to continue fighting on the scale it once had. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. For the thousands of B-17 crews who had crossed Europe again and again, the war was finally over. Many returned home. Thousands never did. The numbers remain staggering. More than 12,700 B-17 flying fortresses were built during the war. The 8th Air Force alone lost over 4,700 heavy bombers in combat. More than 26,000 American airmen serving in that force were killed, making it one of the deadliest assignments in the entire United States military during the Second World War. Yet despite those losses, the Flying Fortress earned a reputation almost no other bomber achieved. Stories spread across every airfield in England. B-17s returning with entire sections of wing missing, bombers landing with one engine still running, aircraft peppered with hundreds of bullet holes, crews climbing out of airplanes that looked impossible to fly. Some of those stories became legendary. In May 1943, the Memphis Belle became one of the first B-17s to complete 25 combat missions, turning its crew into national heroes and proving that survival, while unlikely, was possible. Another flying fortress, all American, returned safely after a mid-air collision that nearly tore its tail completely away. Photographs of the damaged aircraft became some of the most famous aviation images ever taken. Perhaps the most extraordinary story belonged to Olde pub. On December 20th, 1943, after a bombing mission over Bremen, the badly damaged B-17 drifted away from its formation. Its tail was shredded, engines were failing, crew members were wounded or dead. A German fighter pilot, Franz Stigler, intercepted the crippled bomber. He had every opportunity to shoot it down. Instead, after seeing the condition of the aircraft and its wounded crew, he chose not to fire. He escorted the Flying Fortress toward the North Sea, saluted the American crew, and turned away. The B-17 made it back to England. Decades later, Stigler and the bomber's pilot, Charlie Brown, met in peacetime and became close friends until their deaths. It remains one of the most remarkable acts of humanity in aerial warfare. Stories like these transformed the Flying Fortress into something larger than an airplane. It became a symbol. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't. It lacked the range of the B-24, it carried a smaller bomb load, it flew slower than many fighters. Its daylight missions without escort proved catastrophically costly. But what it did possess was extraordinary resilience. It absorbed punishment that destroyed lesser aircraft. It gave crews a chance to come home. And sometimes, in war, a chance is everything. Boeing itself emerged from the conflict transformed. Before the B-17, it had been a struggling aircraft manufacturer fighting simply to survive. By the end of the war, it had become one of the largest aerospace companies in the world. The experience gained designing and mass-producing the Flying Fortress directly influenced the B-29 Superfortress, America's first generation of jet bombers, and eventually the commercial aircraft that would carry millions of passengers across the globe. The company that had nearly lost everything after one prototype crash became one of the defining industrial giants of the 20th century. Ironically, the aircraft that nearly broke America's Air Force also helped build America's aerospace industry. The B-17 program demanded new manufacturing techniques, new logistics systems, new quality control standards, and production volumes that had never been attempted before. It proved that American industry could outproduce any enemy on Earth. By war's end, factories that once struggled to build a handful of bombers each month were producing entire fleets. That industrial capacity became one of the Allies' greatest weapons. Today, fewer than 50 B-17s survive. Only a handful remain AR-worthy. When one of their 4 Wright Cyclone engines starts, the sound is instantly recognizable. A deep mechanical roar that echoes across airfields much as it did over England more than 80 years ago. For veterans, it was the sound of another mission. For historians, it is the sound of one of the most influential aircraft ever built. The Flying Fortress did not win because it was the biggest. It did not win because it was the fastest. It certainly did not win because it was invincible. It won because thousands of engineers kept improving it. Hundreds of thousands of factory workers kept building it. And tens of thousands of young AR men climbed aboard, knowing the odds, and flew anyway. The B-17 almost died before it ever entered production. One forgotten checklist error nearly erased it from history. Instead, it became the bomber that defined America's air war over Europe, helped cripple Nazi Germany's industrial machine, and turned Boeing from a struggling manufacturer into a global aerospace powerhouse. Sometimes history changes because of a revolutionary invention. Sometimes it changes because ordinary people refuse to give up after a catastrophic failure. The Flying Fortress was both. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more documentaries about the companies, engineers, and inventions that changed history. And if there's another aircraft, machine, or company you'd like to see covered next, let me know in the comments. You never know which forgotten story we'll uncover next.